The plain north of Gao is flat and pale, dust and dry grass running out to the horizon under a sky gone white with the heat of early spring. It is the 12th of March, 1591. Two armies are facing each other across this ground, and the difference between what each of them represents, in numbers and resources, in the sheer accumulated weight of history behind them, is so extreme that any observer arriving at that scene, without knowing what came next, would have felt perfectly safe predicting the outcome. On one side, the Songhai, the chronicles written in the years that followed, the Tariq al-Sudan and the Tariq al-Fatish, the two great Arabic language histories of the Western Sudan, composed by scholars who lived through these events, give figures so large that modern historians argue about them seriously. But even a conservative reading speaks of tens of thousands of men, cavalry trained for a lifetime on horseback in the Sahel, infantry who had fought across a territory the size of Western Europe, and in a detail that captures something essential about how differently the two sides understood this particular encounter. A herd of war cattle, driven forward like a living weapon, their mass and panic designed to shatter enemy formations before the fighting began in earnest. On the other side, roughly 4,000 soldiers under a commander named Jutter Pasha. They have just crossed the Sahara. The journey took 3 months. Hundreds of their number died along the way, killed by thirst and sand, and the particular cruelty of a desert that doesn't distinguish between conquerors and everyone else. They are standing on ground they have never seen before, 1,500 miles from home, carrying an exhaustion that has settled deep into the bone. They are also carrying harquebuses. By every visible measure, this should not be a contest. Jutter Pasha gives the order. The harquebuses fire. The Songhai commander sent the cattle forward, a tactic designed to break the Moroccan lines before they can hold, to create the kind of physical chaos that no early modern gunpowder weapon can easily contain. But the cattle hear the guns, and the cattle turn back. The cavalry riding behind them suddenly finds itself in a disaster of its own making, animals and men churning together through dust, the smoke everywhere, a sound unlike anything this army has heard on a battlefield before. The Moroccan line holds, keeps firing, advances. When the smoke cleared over the plain at Tondibi that morning, the Songhai Empire, the largest state West Africa had ever produced, the civilization that had made Timbuktu into a city of gold and books and scholars, was finished as a going concern. A few more months would make it official, but the thing itself was done in a morning. How? That is the question this film exists to answer, not just a tactical question. Guns against cavalry, the brutal arithmetic of a new technology arriving where it has never been. But the deeper one, what was Songhai actually built on? What was Timbuktu at its height? What kind of world did one morning of smoke erase? And why does it matter now that it existed at all? Stay with this. The answers are worth it. The word Timbuktu has drifted so far from its origins it has become, in English, almost a synonym for nowhere. People say it with a vague wave of the hand, meaning somewhere impossibly remote, somewhere at the outer limit of conceivable, a place so far from the center of things that it barely qualifies as real. It is the word English speakers have chosen, without quite knowing why, for the concept of the edge of the world. The irony is nearly perfect, because the city that gave English this expression, the actual Timbuktu, the one that sat at the northern edge of the Niger inland delta in what is now the country of Mali, was, for much of the 15th and 16th centuries, one of the most connected, most cosmopolitan, most intellectually alive places on the surface of the earth. Caravans from Morocco, from Egypt, from the great trading cities of North Africa, arrived and departed in a constant rhythm. Scholars from Fez and Cairo came to study and to teach. The book trade was a serious commercial enterprise, and owning a large personal library was a marker of social standing as reliable as owning a large house. Manuscripts on celestial mechanics, on legal theory, on medicine, on arithmetic, on history and biography circulated among a literate elite whose network stretched thousands of miles in every direction. This is not romanticization. The evidence is physical. It exists right now in libraries and private homes and research institutes. Hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, written in Arabic and in local African languages, produced in and around Timbuktu and the cities of the Niger Bend over roughly 5 centuries. Many are only beginning to be cataloged. Many have never been translated into any European language. They are an archive that scholars are still learning to read in full, and what they reveal document by document, is a civilization of considerable intellectual sophistication, one that the Western historical tradition spent a very long time insisting could not have existed. This film is the story of how that civilization was built and how it was destroyed. But it is also the story of something larger. The arquebuses that fired at Tondibi in 1591 belonged to the same technological revolution that was, in those same decades, carrying Portuguese sailors along the coast of Africa and Asia, Spanish forces through the Americas, Ottoman janissaries across the Middle East. Gunpowder firearms were rewriting the terms of military power across the entire planet within the span of a single human lifetime. What happened to Timbuktu was not an isolated catastrophe. It was a local instance of a global reckoning, a redistribution of power toward whoever held the new technology, regardless of how wealthy or learned or ancient the civilization on the other side happened to be. We will follow the story as it unfolded, from the geography that made Songhai possible, through the extraordinary people who built it to its peak, through the city of books at the center of it all, through the cracks that opened from within, to the morning at Tondibi, and the difficult, unfinished question of what survived. The ending, as you might expect of any story worth telling, is more complicated than it first appears. To understand how Songhai became what it became, you have to start with geography, not as abstract background, not as the obligatory paragraph about climate and topography before the interesting part starts, but as material fact, the thing that determined what people could grow, what they could trade, which routes they could control, and what kind of wealth those routes could generate. Geography, in this story, is not scenery. It is the engine. West Africa in the 14th and 15th centuries sits between two realities that could not be more different from each other. To the north, the Sahara, 3.5 million square miles of rock and sand and heat, the largest hot desert on Earth, a place that kills the unprepared quickly and the well-prepared slowly. To the south, the coastal forests and river systems of the tropics, dense and productive but difficult to move through, largely closed to the long-distance overland trade that was the economic engine of the medieval world. Between them, running roughly east to west across the interior of the continent, lies the Sahel, a band of semi-arid grassland and savanna, dry enough to travel through without the obstruction of the forest, wet enough to sustain large settled populations, cultivable enough to feed them. This is the operational landscape of everything that follows. And through the heart of this landscape runs the Niger River. The Niger is one of the great rivers of the world. It is also one of the most counterintuitive. It rises in the highlands of what is now Guinea, not far from the Atlantic coast as it happens, and then flows northeast, apparently toward the Sahara, apparently toward its own destruction. Then, just as the desert seems about to swallow it, it bends. It arcs back to the southeast in a great curve, the Niger Bend, before eventually turning south toward the Gulf of Guinea more than 4,000 kilometers from where it began. That bend, that apparent mistake the river makes toward the desert and then away from it, creates something remarkable at its northern apex, a point where the river comes within a few dozen miles of Sahara's southern edge before pulling away again. And at that point, where the river and the desert come closest to touching, is where Timbuktu sits. The practical consequence of this geography is immense. In the low-lying floodplain at the top of the Niger Bend, the river spreads out into what geographers call the Niger Inland Delta, a vast patchwork of channels, lakes, and seasonally flooded grasslands that fills with water during the rains and slowly contracts as the dry months come. This delta is extraordinarily fertile. It produces rice, fish, and pasture in quantities capable of sustaining dense human settlement. Jen, one of the great commercial cities of the medieval Sudan, sits at the delta's southern edge. Timbuktu sits at its northern edge. Between them, the river is a highway, the fastest, most reliable means of moving bulk goods across hundreds of kilometers of difficult terrain. And from Timbuktu northward, the Saharan caravan routes begin, threading through the desert along tracks maintained by Tuareg and Berber peoples who had navigated them for centuries, connecting the western Sudan to Morocco, to Egypt, to the Mediterranean world beyond. What moved along these routes was not merely valuable. It was, in the context of the medieval world economy, foundational. From the south came gold. The gold fields of Bambuk, in the river valleys between the Senegal and Falim rivers, in what is now western Mali and Senegal, and the fields of Beret, further east in the highlands of present-day Guinea, had been producing gold since at least the 8th century of the Common Era. Arab geographers writing in the 10th and 11th centuries described the wealth of the gold-producing regions of the Sudan with a wonder that occasionally toppled into mythology. Stories of gold growing from the earth like plants, of rulers so wealthy they could tether their horses to boulders of pure metal. The myths grew in the telling, but the underlying reality was not mythological at all. West Africa was producing gold at a scale that made it one of the primary sources of that metal for the entire known world during the medieval period. Some historians estimate that the greater part of the gold circulating through medieval European and Mediterranean economies originated in these West African mines. From the north came salt. In the deep Sahara, at a place called the Gaza, there are deposits of rock salt so extensive that the buildings of the mining town were reportedly constructed from it. Walls of salt, roof with camel skins, in one of the most wretched and inhospitable places on earth. The great Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta passed through to Gaza in the 1450s and described it with barely contained dismay. No food, no water for hundreds of miles in any direction. The workers effectively prisoners of their own employment. The conditions such that anyone not already committed to the journey would have turned back immediately. But the salt was indispensable. In the tropical and semi-arid regions of the Sudan, where the geology produces no natural salt deposits, where heat and labor demanded in quantities the body cannot do without, salt was genuinely scarce and genuinely precious. A slab of Tagaza rock salt could, at the right moment in the right market, command a price roughly equivalent to its weight in gold. Gold moving north, salt coming south. These were the pillars, but they were not the whole structure. Cloth, copper, cola nuts, horses, enslaved people, 100 other goods move along these routes in both directions. Each one profitable, each one contributing to the commercial ecosystem of the Niger Bend. Timbuktu was not primarily a place of production. It was a place of exchange, a market node at the hinge between two ecological and economic worlds, extracting its wealth from the volume of everything that passed through its markets. The city did not make the gold. It made the deal. The state that first mastered this geography at scale was not Songhai. It was Mali. The Mali Empire rose to regional dominance in the 13th century, a process tied in oral tradition to the figure of Sundiata Keita, the exiled prince, the unexpected return, the defeat of a tyrant, the founding of a kingdom. The griots of West Africa have told this story for 8 centuries, and it remains one of the great foundation narratives of African history. What is not in dispute is the political outcome. Under Sundiata and his successors, Mali expanded control both the gold-producing regions of the south and the major Saharan termini of the north. For roughly a century, it was the dominant power in the western Sudan, and its rulers were among the wealthiest individuals alive on earth. The peak of Mali's reputation in the wider world came in 1324, when the Emperor Musa Musa made his pilgrimage to Mecca. He traveled with retinue that contemporary accounts place in the tens of thousands, and he carried so much gold that his spending in Cairo on the way reportedly depressed the price of that metal on Egyptian markets for more than a decade. The medieval historian Al-Amari interviewed Egyptian officials who had met Musa Musa in person and described the encounter with a bafflement that still reads, 7 centuries later, as entirely genuine. Men of a great city, themselves accustomed to wealth, confronted with a scale of richness they simply had no prior category for. European cartographers put Timbuktu on their maps within a generation of this pilgrimage, sometimes labeling it in gold ink. But empires fracture, and Mali's fracture was long and unglamorous. The succession struggles began almost immediately after Musa Musa's death around 1337. Tuareg confederacies, which had inhabited the desert margins of Mali's territory for generations, pressed southward as Mali's military reach contracted. By the 1430s, they held Timbuktu outright, a transfer of control that spoke more eloquently than any chronicle passage about how far the old order had decayed. Tributary states at the edges of Mali's authority quietly detached themselves. The administrative coherence that had held a vast territory together gradually dissolved. And at Gao, on the eastern arc of the Niger Bend, the Songhai were watching. They had been there a long time. Gao had been a significant trading settlement since at least the 7th century of the Common Era. The Songhai-speaking people, whose language belongs to the Nilo-Saharan family, distinct from a Mande-speaking world that had built Mali, had their own political history, their own relationship with the Niger and its commerce, their own memory of what it meant to be powerful and what it meant to be subordinate. They had occupied both positions in their time. By the middle of the 15th century, as Mali's capacity to enforce anything steadily shrank, the ruler at Gao was essentially independent in all but name. That ruler, by around 1464, was a man the chronicles would call Sunni Ali Br, Ali the Great. He had been watching the collapse of the old order with the clarity of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of opening. What he did with it would reshape the Western Sudan more completely than anything that had happened in a century. But it would also set in motion a conflict between the sword and the pen, between conquest and scholarship, that would define the Songhai Empire until its last morning. Sunni Ali Br was, by any measure that matters in the military history of the 15th century, one of the most formidable commanders West Africa had ever produced. He was also one of the most controversial, and the two facts are not unrelated, because the controversy is almost entirely a product of who was doing the writing about him. He came to power at Gao around 1464, inheriting a kingdom that was independent from Mali in practice, if not entirely in formal fact. What he did in the following 3 decades was methodical, relentless, and in its cumulative scope, staggering. He expanded Songhai's reach along the Niger and its tributaries, absorbed territories that Mali had once controlled, pushed back Tuareg authority where he could reach it, and incorporated the commercial networks of the Niger Bend into a state that was beginning for the first time to look and function like an empire. The instrument he used, more than any cavalry arm or any piece of diplomatic skill, was something his predecessors had never developed to anything like the same degree. He built a fleet. The Niger was not merely a highway in Songhai strategic thinking. Under Sunni Ali, it became an operational theater. He assembled a substantial force of war canoes, large, shallow-drafted vessels capable of moving quickly through the braided channels and seasonal floodplains of the inland delta, and staffed them with a specialized corps of fighters and sailors. The Songhai-speaking people had been river people long before they were imperial subjects. They fished the Niger, traded on it, knew its currents and its seasonal rhythms, its dry season shallows and its flood season deeps, better than any enemy could hope to replicate from the outside. Sunni Ali took this inherited knowledge and made it into a weapon. The fleet gave him something rare in the military landscape of the 15th century Sahel: genuine operational flexibility. An army on horseback is constrained by the availability of water, by the passability of terrain, by the speed at which food and equipment can be moved overland across a landscape that offers no shortcuts. A river fleet moves faster, carries more, and can strike at points along a 1,000-kilometer waterway that no purely land-based defense can adequately cover simultaneously. When Sunni Ali moved against a Niger Bend city, his canoes could appear before his cavalry or after it, or at the same moment, cutting off escape by water, while cavalry blocked escape by land. And the combination was, by the evidence of what followed, extremely difficult to resist. He used it to keep his subjects in line, to supply campaigns that would otherwise have been logistically impossible, and demonstrate that Songhai could project power along the river faster than anyone else could respond. Timbuktu was the first major test. By 1468, the Tuareg leader who controlled the city, a man named Akilu, faced the kind of calculation that a general like Sunni Ali was very good at forcing. Fight a commander who had just demonstrated that he could move men and material along the Niger faster than expected, in greater numbers than anticipated, with a river fleet that made conventional counterpositioning almost impossible, or negotiate. Akila chose to negotiate. He sent word to Sunni Ali that Timbuktu would be surrendered, and then, apparently deciding that staying to see how the transaction concluded was not in his interests, he left. He took with him as many of the scholarly families as he could gather, heading northwest toward the desert trading town of Walata, carrying their books and their children and their professional grievance in equal measure. This detail matters more than it might appear. The scholars who fled with Akilu were the Sanhaja, the Islamic scholarly class that had been closely aligned with Tuareg administration of the city for 3 decades. They had flourished under Tuareg patronage. They ran the mosques, the schools, the legal courts. They were the institutional center of Timbuktu's intellectual life, and they had no particular reason to expect anything good from the man marching toward them from Gao. The ones who stayed, or could not move quickly enough, were right to be worried. Sunni Ali entered Timbuktu in January of 1468. The Tariq al-Sudan, the chronicle written several decades later by scholars whose families carried vivid institutional memory of this period, describes what followed in terms of unambiguous horror. The city's learned men humiliated, imprisoned, killed. Scholars who had devoted their lives to law and theology driven from their homes by soldiers who had no use for either. The sacred landscape of the city violated by a man whose relationship to Islam, in the scholars' telling, was so deficient as to be almost insulting. Here we have to be careful, because this is a moment where the sources and the history pull in directions that are not quite the same. The Tariq al-Sudan and his companion text, the Tariq al-Fatish, were both written by scholars, men whose intellectual class had direct, personal, generational reasons to despise Sunni Ali and everything he represented. They were not disinterested reporters. When they call him a tyrant, a transgressor, a pagan practitioner of magic who oppressed the righteous, they are writing from inside a long institutional grievance. Reading these texts historically requires holding two things simultaneously. The genuine violence they describe was almost certainly real, and the portrait they paint is almost certainly partial. What seems more accurate than the Chronicle's flat indictment is something more complicated. Sunni Ali was Muslim in a way that many rulers of his time and place were Muslim, syncretically, selectively, in ways that mix Islamic observance with traditional religious practice in proportions that the strictly trained scholarly class found intolerable. This was not unusual in the Sahel. What was unusual was the scale of his hostility toward a specific clerical establishment that he appears to have regarded as politically dangerous, aligned with the Tuareg, skeptical of his authority, and capable of making his rule seem illegitimate in the eyes of the wider Islamic world. He was not persecuting Islam. He was cutting down a rival power center that happened to be organized around Islamic learning. Whether this distinction made any difference to the scholars who lost their libraries and their colleagues to the soldiers is, of course, another question. He did not linger at Timbuktu once its immediate political situation was settled. He turned south toward Jen. Jen is a different kind of city. Where Timbuktu sits at the desert's edge, open to the Sahara on the north and the river on the south, Jen occupies a raised island in the middle of the Niger inland delta, surrounded for much of the year by the floodwaters of the wet season, connected to the wider world by water when it floods and by narrow land approaches when it recedes. In the wet months, when the delta fills and the approaches become a maze of channels, conventional assault is nearly impossible. In the dry months, when the ground appears passable, the city's defenders have had months to observe their enemies and bring in whatever they need. Jen had been resisting external pressure for generations. It knew how to make a siege last. The chronicles say it lasted 7 years, 7 months, and 7 days. Historians read this figure the way they read all such round-number chronicle claims, as an expression completeness rather than precise chronology. The repetition of 7 a formulaic marker that something took a very long time. But the essential truth inside the formula is real. Jen did not fall quickly. Sunni Ali, for all his ferocity, was also capable of patience. He maintained his forces around the city through multiple flood cycles, apparently using his river fleet to sustain the blockade through the wet seasons when land access was cut off. The same innovation that had made him so effective elsewhere now applied to a different kind of problem. When Jen finally submitted, probably sometime around 1473, it surrendered to a commander who had demonstrated that he would simply wait as long as the situation required. He treated the city differently from Timbuktu. The king of Jen was handled with a degree of respect. His daughter, according to chronicles, was taken into Sunni Ali's household. Whether this reflected genuine magnanimity or a calculated assessment that a city which yields voluntarily is more governable than one which has been broken is impossible to determine from the available evidence. Quite possibly both. By the time Sunni Ali was finished, which is to say, by the time he died, Songhai controlled the core of the Niger Band, Timbuktu, Jen Gao, and the river system connecting them. It commanded the southern terminals of the major Saharan caravan routes. It possessed a military infrastructure, the fleet, the cavalry, a nascent administrative apparatus that no rival in the Western Sudan could match. What it conspicuously lacked, and what the scholars writing about it would not allow anyone forget, was a settled, legitimate Islamic mode of governance. Whether this actually mattered to the farmers, merchants, and fishermen of the Niger Bend, who were not writing chronicles, is a question the historical record cannot adequately answer. What it mattered to was the scholars, and the scholars were the ones holding the pens. He died in late 1492. The circumstances are unclear even in sources that had every reason to want a full story on record. A man of his stature, dying gloriously, crossing a river somewhere in the Sahel. He did not come out. His son Sunni Baru inherited the empire. Sunni Baru would hold power for approximately 8 months. The man who replaced him had been watching this moment approach, consciously or not, for years. He was a military commander who had served under Sunni Ali himself. He was publicly, pointedly, extravagantly committed to the Islamic scholarly class that his predecessor had spent a career terrorizing. And he understood something that Sunni Ali, for all his military genius, had seemingly never grasped, that the scholars of Timbuktu were not merely a clerical nuisance to be managed or occasionally persecuted. They were an instrument of legitimacy. In the right hands, they could make a ruler into something that no campaign season, however successful, could manufacture. His name was Muhammad Tur. History would call him Askia the Great. In the spring of 1493, Muhammad Tur led an army from Gao to confront Sunni Baru. The grounds, if ground were needed, were religious. Sunni Baru had reportedly declined to commit to the rigorous Islamic governance that the scholars of Timbuktu had been demanding, in increasingly pointed language, for the better part of 3 decades. The same demand his father had spent his entire reign ignoring. Muhammad Tur raised the banner of reform. He carried the endorsement of the scholarly class. He had the backing of enough military commanders to make his rebellion viable, and he framed the enterprise as something closer to a holy obligation than a coup. When you are overthrowing a king and you need soldiers willing to fight for you, calling it a restoration of righteousness is considerably more motivating than calling a bid for personal power. The two forces met somewhere in the region of the Niger Bend. The chronicles are imprecise enough about the location that historians disagree on the details, at a place called Anfeo. The encounter was not prolonged. Sunni Baru was defeated, captured, and exiled to an island in the Niger, where he would spend the rest of his life in circumstances that were comfortable enough to signal magnanimity, but complete enough to signal finality. No execution. Muhammad Tur was making a specific kind of argument about what his rule was and what it was not, and killing the son of the man he was overthrown would have cluttered the story he needed to tell. The story was this. He was not a usurper. He was a corrective. The Sunni dynasty had failed Songhai not by losing a battle, but by losing something more fundamental. The moral and religious legitimacy that made a ruler's authority legible to the people governed and to the wider Islamic world beyond. Muhammad Tur was restoring what had been lost. He said so explicitly, and the scholars of Timbuktu said so on his behalf, loudly and in Arabic, in forms that would travel far beyond the Niger Bend. The scholars received him with something close to open relief. This alliance, between a soldier's coup and a city of scholars, would produce something neither could have built alone. But to understand its full shape and how far Muhammad Tur's reach would extend, you need to follow him out of Gao, 3 years after seizing power, onto the road to Mecca. Because the man who left Songhai in 1496 came back with something that transformed the empire from the inside out. And the story of that transformation begins on a pilgrimage road. The pilgrimage to Mecca that Askia Muhammad undertook in 1496 was not a private act of faith. Nothing he did was private, but this least of all, he traveled with a retinue befitting a sovereign, a large escort, enough ceremony and provision to signal to every ruler and scholar encountered along the route that this was not a private citizen making a personal journey, but a head of state presenting himself to the wider Islamic world. According to the Tariq al-Sudan, he carried in the vicinity of 300,000 gold pieces, a figure the chronicles offer with a straightforward confidence they apply to large numbers generally, which is to say it may be exact and it may be dramatically round, but the underlying reality is not in doubt. Askia Muhammad arrived at the holy cities with resources sufficient to make an impression. He distributed gold along the route. He endowed charitable institutions. He conducted himself as a man of wealth and devotion and ambition in exactly equal measure. He stopped in Cairo. In 1496, Cairo was still one of the great cities of the world, the seat of the Mamluk Sultanate and the home of the Abbasid Caliphate, or what remained of it. The original caliphate in Baghdad had been destroyed by the Mongol invasion in 1258. The Mamluks had subsequently installed a survivor of the Abbasid line in Cairo as a ceremonial caliph, a figure of religious legitimacy with no real political power, but whose symbolic authority still carried weight across the Sunni Muslim world. It was to this caliph, Al-Mutawakkil III, a man whose power was almost entirely performative but whose title was not, that Askia Muhammad presented himself. What followed is described in the Tariq al-Sudan with a ceremonial vividness that suggests the event was carefully remembered. The caliph, according to Chronicle, recognized Askia Muhammad as the legitimate ruler of Songhai and granted him a title, the caliph's deputy in the Sudan, his representative in the western regions of the known world. He placed a white turban on Askia's head. He gave him a sword. Historians read this episode with caution. The Abbasid caliph in Cairo had very little capacity to grant anything that could be enforced. What he could grant, and what Askia Muhammad clearly understood to be the point, was legitimacy in a form that traveled, a form that could be invoked in Friday prayers across the empire, described in letters to scholars in Fez and Cairo, used to transform what had been, in its origins, a successful military coup into something that looked, from a respectful distance, like a divinely sanctioned order. The scholars of Timbuktu, who were now fully invested in his rule, and who needed their patron to be seen as legitimate by the wider Islamic world, were exceptionally good at this kind of description. They were, after all, scholars. He returned to Gao in 1497. The empire he came back to began, almost immediately, to look different from the one he had left. The administrative transformation of the decade that followed was, in the language of modern political science, state building of a high order. He divided Songhai's vast territory into provinces, each governed by an appointed official, not a hereditary local lord whose loyalty was a matter of lineage and negotiation, but a designated representative whose authority derived from the center and could, theoretically, be revoked from it. He established specialized roles within the royal administration, officials responsible for agriculture, others managing the river fleet, still others overseeing the markets and the weights and measures used in commercial transactions. Standardized weights and measures might read like bureaucratic minutiae, but in a commercial empire built on the trust that a measure of gold weighs the same in Gao as it does in Timbuktu, this kind of standardization is the difference between a functional economy and a chronic source of dispute. He understood this. He fixed it. One of the scholars who shaped his governing philosophy most directly was a man named Muhammad al-Maghili, an Algerian jurist from the city of Tlemcen, who traveled to the western Sudan in the 1490s and engaged Askia in sustained exchanges about Islamic governance. Al-Maghili was a rigorous, sometimes fierce thinker whose record outside of these exchanges is complicated. He had been involved in the persecution of Jewish communities in North Africa, a fact that sits uneasily alongside his intellectual reputation. But his political writings, composed at Askia's specific invitation, were a serious engagement with how a large West African state could be organized along Islamic legal principles. The text he wrote for Askia, known as the Obligations of Princes, addressed taxation, the conduct of war, the rights and obligations of subjects, the relationship between secular administration and religious law. It gave the Songhai administration a coherent ideological architecture. It also gave its critics a very clear standard against which to measure every subsequent ruler. The peak of this arrangement, the scholar-ruler alliance at its most productive, lasted roughly 2 decades. During that period, Songhai was, by almost any measure available to a historian, the most effectively governed state in the western Sudan. Its markets functioned. Its justice was administered through recognized channels. Its military remained capable. And at the center of it all, the city the empire could not do without was in the middle of something extraordinary. But empires governed by men who age are also empires vulnerable to what age does to men. By the 1520s, Askia Muhammad was old and going blind. In 1528, his son Musa led a revolt that the aging emperor could no longer effectively resist. The man who had made himself caliph and built a state from a soldier's coup was deposed by his own children and sent to an island in the Niger, present but powerless, alive but finished. He was brought back in his final years to live inside of the capital he had built. He died in 1538. What he left behind was a state that still worked, a city that was still, in 1528, one of the intellectual centers of the known world. What he also left behind was a succession problem that would come over the following 60 years to matter more than everything else. But that is the next chapter's story. First, the city itself. Stand in Timbuktu in, let us say, 1510. The city holds somewhere around 25,000 permanent residents. This is a figure offered by Leo Africanus, Al-Hassan ibn Muhammad al-Wazn, the Moroccan diplomat and traveler whose account of West Africa, written after his visit around 1510, became for European readers the primary window onto this world for the following 3 centuries. Historians debate whether the figure captures the full population, including seasonal traders and students and residents, or merely the settled core. What is not in debate is that Timbuktu at its height was a significant urban center by any contemporary standard, comparable in scale, if not in political importance, to many of provincial cities of the Mediterranean world in the same period. The streets are unpaved. The architecture is earthen, buildings constructed from banco, a mixture of mud and organic material that gives the city's structures their characteristic soft, almost sculptural quality. Walls rounded where wooden frames would create sharp corners in stone construction elsewhere. In the heat of the Saharan summer, these walls breathe. They absorb the overnight cool and release it slowly through the day in a way that makes the interiors livable at temperatures that stone or brick would not allow. The city's builders understood their material precisely. They also knew it required constant maintenance. Banco erodes in the brief but intense rainy season, and the community's labor cycle includes regular repair and replastering that functions almost as a seasonal ritual. The Great Mosque of Jingareber, built in 1327 under Musa Musa's patronage after his return from the pilgrimage that had astonished Cairo, is the city's oldest major monument and its most visually commanding. Its conical minarets bristling with permanent wooden scaffold poles, the structural framework for this ongoing renewal. 3 mosques anchor the city's intellectual life, though calling them merely mosques is something like calling the medieval universities of Bologna or Paris merely churches. Jingareber in the southwest is the largest and oldest, the congregational mosque where the Sultan prays, where the most formal public religious observances take place. Sidi Yahya, built sometime in the 1500s, sits closer to the city's commercial center. Sangkor, in the northern quarter, is the one that visitors most often reach for superlatives to describe. It is not a university in any European institutional sense. No fixed curriculum, no administration granting degrees, no unified governing body. What exists around Sangkor is better understood as an ecology of learning. Individual scholars of great reputation who attract students, who teach in the mosque's courtyard and in their own homes, who correspond with peers across the Islamic world, who copy and commission manuscripts, who build private libraries and lend from them and argue in them, and occasionally write pointed critiques of each other's positions in the margins of shared texts. At its peak in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, estimates of the number of students attached to the scholarly community range from 10,000 to 25,000, figures that historians treat as expressions of scale rather than census data, but which nonetheless indicate something remarkable. A small city at the desert's edge functioning as a destination for serious scholars arriving from across North and West Africa. What were they studying? This question sat at the heart of one of the more consequential distortions in the Western understanding of African history. The assumption, sometimes stated outright and sometimes simply embedded in the absence of curiosity, that there was nothing here worth studying. That the Islamic scholarly tradition in West Africa was a thin veneer over a fundamentally non-literate culture, a matter of rote Quranic recitation, rather than genuine intellectual engagement with the questions that define a civilization. The manuscripts answer this assumption directly, not with argument, but with evidence. The corpus of text produced in and around Timbuktu, written, copied, commissioned, and collected there over roughly 5 centuries, numbers by current scholarly estimates, somewhere in the hundreds of thousands. Some researchers put the figure higher. They are distributed across a wide range of private collections, many still held by the families of the scholars who originally assembled them, as well as in institutional archives, including the Ahmed Baba Institute in Timbuktu itself. The full scope of this archive is still being established. The work of cataloging and conserving has been ongoing for decades and is not complete. What the catalog text reveals is a body of work covering, in serious and technical depth, an extraordinary range of subjects. There are texts on Islamic jurisprudence, specifically the Maliki school of law dominant across North and West Africa, that engage with the most complex questions of legal theory and practice: property, inheritance, marriage, contract, the conduct of commerce, the rights of enslaved people, the obligations of rulers toward the ruled. These are not simplifications for a provincial audience. They are contributions to a live, international legal conversation, and some of the Timbuktu jurists were regarded by their peers in Cairo and Fez as significant voices within it. There are manuscripts on astronomy and mathematics, on the movements of the planets and stars, the calculation of lunar calendars, the geometry of the prayer direction toward Mecca. The tradition of Islamic astronomy was, in this period, among the most sophisticated in the world, and the scholars of Timbuktu participated in it. There are medical texts drawing on and extending the Arabic translation of the classical Greek medical tradition, pharmacology, the treatment of specific diseases, surgical technique. There are texts on history and biography, careful accounts of rulers and dynasties and cities that constitute a primary source base for the history of the Western Sudan that historians are still learning to use fully. There is Sufi literature, mystical poetry, commentary layered on commentary, the accumulated textual life of a culture that took the written word with complete seriousness. And there are the private libraries. The institution of the private library, the personal collection assembled by a scholar over a lifetime, lent to students, consulted by colleagues, eventually passed to children or disciples or the mosque the scholar had served, was as central to Timbuktu's intellectual culture as the public mosque itself. A scholar's library was simultaneously a working tool, a measure of standing, and a legacy. The largest collections ran to thousands of volumes. Even modest scholars maintain hundreds. The man who makes this most vivid is Ahmad Baba al-Timbukti. Ahmad Baba was born in Timbuktu in 1556 into one of the city's great scholarly families, a lineage of jurists and teachers stretching back several generations, the kind of pedigree that in Timbuktu carried the weight that military distinction carried in Gao. By the time the Moroccan army arrived in 1591, he had become one of the most respected scholars in the city, a jurist of the Maliki school, a biographer, a grammarian, a man whose learning was wide enough and deep enough that his opinions were sought on questions ranging from the ethics of enslaving members of specific West African ethnic groups, an issue on which he wrote a significant and careful legal treatise, to the correct reading of disputed Quranic passages. When the Moroccans arrested him in 1593, he was among a group of scholars seized and marched north to Marrakesh as part of the new administration's effort to neutralize the city's intellectual establishment. He was taken from a house containing his working library. What he said about this in Marrakesh, in the context of a formal complaint about what had been confiscated, has survived. He told his captors that he was the least learned among Timbuktu scholars, and that even he had owned more than 1,600 books. Let that number settle. 1,600 books. And he is describing himself as the baseline, the floor of what a scholar standing in Timbuktu might possess. The men above him in the scholarly hierarchy own more. The institutional collections at the mosques dwarfed individual holdings. This was not a culture that treated books as luxury objects or devotional curios. It was a culture that produced, bought, sold, copied, lent, borrowed, and argued about books the way any serious intellectual culture does, as the primary medium of thought. Leo Africanus himself, in his account of Timbuktu, made an observation that his European readers in the 16th century found barely credible, that the profit made from the manuscript and book trade exceeded what merchants earned from any other line of commerce in the city. Books were copied to order. Scholars hired professional copyists. Manuscripts were imported from North Africa and Egypt. The infrastructure of the book trade, the copyists, the dealers, the commissioners, the collectors, constituted a distinct layer of the city's commercial life, as recognizable and economically significant as the gold trade that everyone on the outside paid attention to. He also said this about the city's scholarly class, that the king maintained many doctors, judges, and learned men at his own expense, that this patronage was not occasional or ceremonial but structural. The ruler's investment in scholarship as a source of legitimacy and administrative capacity made concrete in salaries and stipends and the provision of housing. Who populated the city? Timbuktu at its height was not a homogeneous community. Permanent residents included Songhai-speaking people, Tuareg families who had maintained a presence and superior control, Wang-era merchants from the southern trading networks, Songhai scholars whose ancestors had been there since the Malian period, Moroccan and North African traders in transit and in residence. Scholars and students arrived from across the Islamic world, staying months or years or the rest of their lives. Arabic functioned as a scholarly and commercial lingua franca. Songhai was a language of street life and administration. Tamashek, the Tuareg language, was widely understood in the merchant quarters. The city ran, in short, on the kind of productive multilingualism that only happens when people from very different places discover they need each other. This is what existed. This is what the world looked like. If you were willing to read the whole map, not just the parts with European coastlines on them. A city in the Sahel trading in gold and salt and manuscripts, running on camels and river canoes, and the accumulated expertise of scholars who have been building their libraries for generations. A city whose intellectual reach touched Cairo and Fez and Mecca, whose inhabitants spoke several languages, and argued constantly about the finer points of law and astronomy, whose book trade generated more revenue than any other sector of its commercial life. And in 1510, 1520, 1530, in the decades when Ahmad Baba was being born and educated, when his teachers were at their peak and the libraries were at their fullest, no one standing in Timbuktu had particular reason to believe it would end. That complacency had a specific shape, and the shape was inside the empire itself, not outside it. The Songhai Empire that Askia Muhammad had built was, in its administrative essentials, a system that ran on the quality of the person at its center. This is not a distinctive flaw. It describes most pre-modern states and a fair number of modern ones. But in Songhai, it created a specific vulnerability that would take 6 decades to become fatal, because the empire had no stable, agreed mechanism for determining who ruled next. This is not a minor administrative oversight. It is the single most destabilizing structural feature any pre-modern state can possess, because it means that every transition of power is a potential civil war, and every ruler's death is a crisis that the state's institutions must survive or fail to. The Songhai state that Askia Muhammad had constructed was sophisticated enough to function extremely well under a capable, legitimate, administratively attentive ruler. It was not robust enough to survive a long sequence of disputed successions, because the thing holding together was never the institutions themselves. It was always the man running them. The first crack opened in 1528, and Askia Muhammad himself had put it there, not intentionally and not recently, but by the act that had made him ruler in the first place. He had deposed the king in 1493. He had done it with military force, religious framing, and scholarly endorsement. He had done it so successfully that the coup became, in retrospect, a restoration rather than a seizure. But the method was now on the record. The demonstrated fact that a capable officer with the right coalition and the right argument could overthrow a sitting ruler did not evaporate just because the man who demonstrated it had subsequently governed well. His son Musa had been watching for years, as had his other sons, and the provincial governors whose own positions depended on how the next transition played out. In 1528, Musa moved. The elderly emperor, largely blind by then, could not organize an adequate response. He had the loyalty of some commanders and not others, and in a military state the commanders who do not back you are, ultimately, the ones who matter. He was opposed and sent to an island in the Niger, the same island where Sunni Baru had been exiled in 1493, a symmetry that the scholars of Timbuktu certainly noticed and perhaps recorded with a deliberate pointedness. He would spend years there before being brought back to Gao to live out his final days within sight of the city he had made. He died in 1538. Askia Musa lasted 3 years. He was killed by his brothers. This is where the problem becomes categorical rather than individual. What followed was not a series of bad rulers making avoidable mistakes, but the structural operation of a succession system that had no self-correcting mechanism. Each disputed transition weakened the administrative machinery a little more. Appointed governors and provinces who had served a deposed ruler were not always retained by a successor. Revenue flows that funded the military and the scholarly patronage became less predictable as the collection mechanisms degraded. The careful relationship between the central court and the scholarly establishment in Timbuktu, which had always required active maintenance by the ruler himself, was not something that could run on inertia during a period of rapid turnover. After Musa came Askia Muhammad Benken, competent, embattled, eventually deposed. Then Askia Ismail. Then Askia Ishaq I. Each transition involved faction, negotiation, sometimes violence. The scholars wrote about these years with controlled anxiety that breaks through even in the most formal of chronicle prose. They could see what was happening, they understood the pattern, and they had limited capacity to affect it. Then, in 1549, something interrupted the pattern. Askia Dawood came to the throne. He would hold it for 33 years. This requires emphasis. 33 years of continuous rule in an empire that had seen 7 rulers in the preceding 21 years. Dawood was not a revolutionary figure in the way Askia Muhammad had been, and he did not pretend to be one. What he was, and what the evidence of his long tenure suggests he understood himself to be, was a keeper of the flame. He sustained the scholarly patronage that was the Songhai state's most distinctive institutional quality. He maintained sufficient military capacity to hold the provinces in order. He was himself literate and intellectually engaged, and the Timbuktu scholars who wrote about him did so with something close to genuine warmth, which for men who were professionally disposed to find fault with rulers is no small thing. Under Dawood, Ahmad Baba grew up. This matters not as biographical coincidence, but as structural fact. The greatest scholar Timbuktu would produce in the 16th century was formed in a period of relative stability, in a city that still functioned as it was supposed to function, under the patronage of a ruler who understood why it was worth preserving. Baba's education, the breadth and rigor of it, the access to libraries and teachers, and the wider world of Islamic scholarship, was the product of a specific political moment that would not last much longer than the man who made it possible. Dawood died in 1582. The 9 years between his death and the mourning at Tondibi produced 4 separate rulers. Askia al-Hajj, who succeeded Dawood, was deposed after 4 years. Askia Muhammad Bani held the throne for 2 years before being replaced. Askia Ishaq II took power in 1588, and he was a man sitting in Gao when the Moroccan army came across the Sahara. Each of these transitions cost something. Provincial cohesion that Dawood had maintained began to fray. Military commanders who had served one ruler found themselves navigating the unfamiliar expectations of his successor, the standardized administration that Askia Muhammad had built. The provincial governors, the market officials, the fleet commanders still existed in form but was increasingly a form without its original content. Offices remained. The consistent authority that had made the offices function had been replaced by contested arrangements that served whoever happened to be strongest at any given moment. Timbuktu itself watched all of this from a position of unusual clarity and unusual powerlessness. The scholars could see the pattern. They could write about it. Several of them did, in terms that suggest they understood the danger. What they could not do was fix the succession problem, because fixing the succession problem required the kind of political authority they had never possessed independently, and which no ruler of this period was inclined to grant them. Meanwhile, in Marrakesh, the succession of Songhai rulers was being watched by a man with a different perspective on what it meant. Ahmad al-Mansur, the Moroccan sultan who had come to power in 1578 after a victory over a Portuguese invasion force at the Battle of the Three Kings, was a ruler of considerable intelligence and even more considerable ambition. His court called him al-Mansur, the victorious. They also called him al-Dahabi, the golden, a title that expressed both his personal wealth and his aspiration for more of it. He had stabilized Morocco's position in the western Mediterranean. He had negotiated effectively with the Ottoman Empire to his east and the English merchants who wanted Moroccan sugar and saltpeter. He ran a sophisticated court where scholarship, politics, and trade were woven together in the way they were in Timbuktu, though from a different angle and toward different ends. He had been paying close attention to the Saharan trade for years. The commercial logic was not difficult to grasp. The gold that came north from the Sudan enriched every market it touched along the way. Whoever controlled the southern terminal of the trans-Saharan trade, the cities where the gold left the Niger Bend and began its journey north, sat at the point where that wealth was most concentrated. Morocco sat at the northern end. If Morocco could also control the southern end, the arithmetic was compelling. The specific flashpoint was to Gaza. The salt mines in the middle of the Sahara had been contested for decades, but in the 1580s, al-Mansur moved from contention to assertion. He sent a military force to seize Gaza outright. The Songhai response was immediate and tactically clever. Askia al-Hajj ordered the workers at the mines to abandon them and relocate, taking their tools and their knowledge to a new site further south. If Morocco could not operate the mines, controlling the territory around them was worthless. The Moroccan force found an emptied settlement and withdrew. Al-Mansur recognized the move for what it was and recalibrated. He sent ambassadors to Gal demanding formal Songhai recognition of Moroccan suzerainty over to Gaza and regular payment of tribute. The Songhai under Askia Ishaq too refused, in terms of the Moroccan sources described as dismissive. Historians debate whether the refusal was principled or simply the default position of a court that had not yet grasped how seriously it was being threatened. What matters for the story is the consequence. Al-Mansur concluded that negotiation was not going to produce what he wanted, and he began planning something that most of his senior advisors told him was impossible. He was going to send an army across the Sahara. When Ahmad al-Mansur proposed a crossing, his council pushed back with force. The distances were too great. The desert between Morocco and the Niger Bend was not merely dangerous. It was the Sahara, the largest hot desert on Earth, and a particular route required to reach Songhai passed through some of its most unforgiving interior. Previous rulers had contemplated similar expeditions and decided against them. An army of any useful size would require food and water at a scale that camels could not realistically carry, and the wells along the route were spaced in ways that depended on exact navigational knowledge that only the most experienced desert guides possessed. The march would take months. An army that arrived, if it arrived, would be reduced and exhausted, and then it would be 1,500 miles from any resupply or reinforcement, facing a military that, whatever its recent troubles, still vastly outnumbered any force that could make it across the desert. The analysis was, in conventional military terms, sound. Al-Mansur acknowledged every point and dismissed all of them. His confidence rested on something his advisors were not fully accounting for. He had harquebuses, and he had a specific piece of intelligence, drawn from traders and travelers and the captives who occasionally passed through Moroccan markets, that the people on the other side of the Sahara had never faced firearms in battle, and had no particular understanding of what they did to a cavalry charge. Whether this intelligence was precisely accurate or whether al-Mansur was filtering it toward the conclusion he had already reached is a question the sources do not resolve. What they do resolve is the outcome of the council debate. Al-Mansur got his expedition. His advisors, overruled, recorded their objections in terms that suggest they believed he was sending men to die for nothing. He sent them anyway, in the autumn of 1590. The man he chose to command was Judar Pasha. Judar's biography is itself a small historical window onto the cosmopolitan violence of the 16th century Mediterranean world. He had been born in the Iberian Peninsula. The sources say a village in the region of Almeria, in what was then the Kingdom of Granada, in the years just after the Spanish crown completed its conquest of the last Muslim-ruled territory in Spain. As a child, he was captured, the exact circumstances are not recorded, and brought to Morocco, where he was raised in the royal household, converted or raised as Muslim, educated, trained for military service, and eventually made his career in the Saadian state. He was a eunuch, as were many palace-trained officers of this period in North African courts. He spoke Spanish. He was, by the time al-Mansur chose him for Sahara crossing, an experienced and trusted commander. The army he led was, in its composition, a document of how thoroughly the 16th century Mediterranean world had been scrambled by conquest and expulsion and conversion and migration. The core of the fighting force was made up of Moriscos, Spanish-speaking Muslims whose ancestors or whose own generation had been expelled from Spain in the decades following 1492, who had rebuilt their lives in Morocco and who brought with them skills in military technology and organization that had been shaped by prolonged contact with the most militarily sophisticated Christian powers in Europe. Among them were men who had operated firearms in the context of European warfare, who understood how to maintain and use harquebuses under conditions of a campaign. The Moroccan cavalry supplemented this corps. There were also Turkish soldiers, veterans of Ottoman campaigns, present in smaller numbers. The total force was roughly 4,000 fighting men, plus the support personnel, guides, camel handlers, water carriers, without whom the crossing could not have been attempted at all. It was not a large army by the standards of 16th century European or Ottoman warfare. Against the forces that Songhai could theoretically put in the field, it was dwarfed. Against an enemy that had never encountered mass firearms, it was, as Al-Mansur had calculated, something different from what the numbers suggested. They left Marrakesh in the autumn of 1590 and pointed themselves south. The Sahara between Morocco and the Niger Bend is not one landscape, but several. The route Jitter's army followed took them to the Dra Valley and then south and east across the Great Ergs, the vast seas of dunes, and past to Gaza, where the abandoned salt mine stood as a reminder why they had come. From Gaza, the route bent south toward the river, through terrain that offered the desert in its most unmediated form. No shelter, limited water, heat during the day and cold at night, and the navigational challenge of finding specific wells across featureless expanses where a degree of error in any direction could be fatal. The chronicles record that men died. The figure varies by source. Some say hundreds. Some give no number but describe the losses as severe. What is consistent across accounts is that the army that emerged at the southern edge of the desert in the early weeks of 1591 was substantially smaller than the one that had left Morocco 4 months earlier, and that the survivors were in the condition that 3 months in the Sahara produces. Gaunt, depleted. Their water carried in skins on the backs of camels, now as exhausted as their riders. They reached the Niger. For most of these men, the Moriscos who had grown up in southern Spain, the Moroccan cavalry who knew the Atlas and the desert margins, the sight of a major river in this landscape would have been something close to hallucinatory. The Niger in the dry season is wide and flat and brown, moving slowly through the Sahel with an apparent indifference to the desert that surrounds it. To men who had spent 3 months in conditions where water was a calculated ration, it must have looked like a reprieve. It was not a reprieve. They were at the beginning of what they had come to do, not the end of it, and word had reached Gao that they were coming. In the court at Gao, the news arrived stripped of precise detail but not of urgency. A Moroccan army had crossed the Sahara. It had emerged from the desert somewhere north and west of the city, battered and reduced in the crossing, but intact enough to matter. It was moving south and east along the river. It was coming. Askia is shocked II, faced a decision with no obviously correct answer. He could pull his forces south, back into the interior, forcing the Moroccans to extend their already strained logistics further into unfamiliar territory, a slow war of attrition that the desert had effectively begun on his behalf. Or he could march north and strike the Moroccan force while it was still recovering, while the men were still hollow from the crossing, before the invaders had time to consolidate their position along the river. He chose to march. This was not a foolish decision. It was a decision that most commanders in his position would have made, and for good reasons. The Songhai army vastly outnumbered the Moroccan force by any credible estimate. The Moroccan soldiers had just spent 3 months walking through the Sahara. Striking them before they recovered had a clear, tactical logic. The war cattle were ready. The cavalry was assembled. Songhai possessed military advantages in every category that conventional assessment could measure. The problem was that the one category it could not measure was a category that would decide everything. The two forces moved toward each other along the river. The specific sequence of encounters and feints in the days before the main engagement is not clearly reconstructed from the chronicles. What is clear is where it ended. On a flat stretch of ground north of Gao, at a site the sources called Tondibi, Askia Ishak to position his forces and prepare for what he believed was a manageable confrontation with an exhausted enemy. He did not know what a harquebus sounded like when several thousand of them fired at once. This is a scene we open with, seen now from inside the story rather than from its frame. The morning of the 12th of March, 1591, the plain flat and pale. The sky already going white with the heat of early spring. 2 armies on either side of the open ground between them, each doing the same rapid, visceral arithmetic that soldiers do when they can finally see what they are up against. What the Moroccan commander saw across that field was the largest force most of them had ever faced in a single engagement. Not the kind of numerical disadvantage that professional soldiers can discount through confidence in their training, but the kind that makes even experienced men recalculate and not like the answer. Judar Pasha had roughly 4,000 fighters, reducing the number that had left Morocco by the losses of the desert crossing, which had been severe. On the other side of the field was a Songhai force that dwarfed that number by any credible measure. The war cattle were visible even at distance, dark shapes moving at the edges of the formation. What the Songhai commander saw across the same field was a tired, depleted army standing in open ground 1,500 miles from home. They had numbers. They had the cavalry. They had the battle experience. The Moroccan force looked exactly like what it was, a body of men that had barely survived the act of arriving. Both assessments were accurate. Neither was complete. Judar Pasha gave the order to form the harquebusiers. The war cattle moved first. This was the established opening. Drive the herd toward the enemy line. Use the sheer physical mass and the panic of the animals to break the formation before cavalry followed through the gap. It had worked in engagements before. Against infantry relying on pike and sword, a herd of cattle moving at speed into a formation creates a chaos that discipline alone cannot immediately organize out of. The Songhai commanders had reason to believe it would work here. The harquebuses fired, the sound of a mass volley from several hundred matchlock firearms, and the Moroccan force included a substantial number of harquebusiers, along with what the chronicles describe in terms that some historians read as a reference to artillery, was unlike anything the Songhai army, or the cattle, had encountered on a battlefield. This is not a small point. We have grown so accustomed to the idea of firearms that it requires a genuine effort of imagination to reconstruct what mass gunfire sounded like to people who had never heard it. Not merely loud, catastrophically loud, the sound arriving before the smoke fully cleared, the two together creating a sensory disorientation for which nothing in prior experience provided a useful reference. And then, across the field, men and animals were falling at distances where no edged weapon could possibly reach them. The cattle heard the guns. The cattle turned back. They turned back into the cavalry advancing behind them. Horses trained for war have a higher threshold of panic than untrained animals, but they are not immune to it, and a herd of terrified cattle moving at speed in the opposite direction to an advancing cavalry line creates exactly the kind of physical confusion that thresholds cannot withstand. Men and animals churned together in the smoke. The second volley fired. The third. The formation that the Songhai commanders had spent their careers learning to manage dissolved not through cowardice or lack of skill, but through the arrival of a problem that no amount of prior experience had equipped anyone to solve. The Moroccan line advanced. The route of an army, once it begins in earnest, is almost impossible to arrest. The motion of retreat spreads through a large force the way fire spreads through dry grass, faster than any order can travel in the opposite direction. Men at the front who see the men beside them turning do not wait to understand the tactical logic. They turn. Men behind them see the motion and respond to it. Within minutes, what had been a military formation is a dispersal, and a dispersal is not something commander can reassemble under continued fire in open ground. Askia is Shak Tu's army, which had arrived at Tondibi with every conventional advantage, left it in fragments. Judar Pasha did not pursue deep into the interior. This restraint was not mercy. It was a calculation of a commander who understood that his army, whatever the morning's outcome, was still 4,000 men in the middle of an unfamiliar country 1,500 miles from resupply, and that overextension was as capable of destroying an army as any defeat in the field. He consolidated his position along the river. He sent scouts toward Gao, and then he did something that tells us more about the Moroccan enterprise than almost anything else in the historical record. He wrote a letter to Ahmad al-Mansur. The contents of that letter, as described in the chronicles, were not what the Sultan of Morocco was expecting to read. Judar Pasha had won the battle. He had won it decisively. The Songhai army was broken, and its ruler was in flight. But the country he had just conquered, he told al-Mansur, was not what the plan had assumed. The cities were earthen. The gold was not sitting in warehouses or royal vaults waiting to be collected. The wealth of the Western Sudan was not a stockpile. It was a system, a living network of commerce and agricultural surplus and scholarly activity that required the ongoing conditions of peace and settled governance to function. You could seize Timbuktu. You could not seize what made Timbuktu valuable, because what made it valuable was not an object, but a circumstance, and the act of conquest was the most efficient possible method of destroying that circumstance. He told the Sultan that the campaign had not yielded what was expected. He asked, in effect, whether it was worth continuing. Ahmad al-Mansur's response was to send a letter back with instructions to proceed. He also began making arrangements to send a new commander, a harder man, less inclined to write letters questioning the enterprise. The replacement, Mahmud ibn Zarkan Pasha, would arrive in 1593. But first there was Gao, and then Timbuktu. Gao fell within weeks of Tondibi. Askia Ishaq II had not remained the capital to defend it. The same logic that had sent him north to meet the Moroccans now sent him south to avoid being trapped. He took what forces remained to him and retreated into the interior, where Songhai resistance would continue for years in a desultory, diminishing form, never strong enough to reverse what Tondibi had decided. Judar Pasha entered Gao and found a city substantially emptied of its court and its movable wealth, the symbols of Songhai imperial power, the regalia, the records, whatever could be carried, already gone south with the retreating administration. Timbuktu surrendered in April of 1591, roughly 5 weeks after Tondibi. The city did not fight. There was no military force capable of defending it, and the scholars who ran its institutions were not soldiers. What greeted Judar Pasha when he entered was a city that had not been physically destroyed, the mosque still standing, the school still structurally intact, the streets still there, but that was already beginning to hollow out. The scholarly families who could leave were leaving. The commercial networks that had brought the book trade and the gold and salt commerce through Timbuktu were disrupted, rerouting themselves through other channels, finding other intermediaries. The infrastructure of intellectual and commercial life that had taken 2 centuries to build was not bombed or burned. It was simply abandoned piece by piece as the conditions that had created it ceased to exist. The occupation that followed was neither orderly nor gentle. Moroccan soldiers helped themselves to whatever they found in the city's households and warehouses. The commercial community that had made Timbuktu function, the Wanyara merchants, the North African trading families, the resident scholars from across the Islamic world, found reasons to be elsewhere. A city of 25,000 people at its height began the slow process of becoming something smaller. The scholars who remained were watching this with the particular clarity of men who understood exactly what was being lost and had no power to prevent it. Ahmad Baba remained in Timbuktu for 2 years after the conquest. He was not passive. He continued to teach, to write, to maintain whatever institutional life he could sustain in a city under occupation. He was, by every account, not a man who accommodated himself easily to the new order, and the new administration took note of this. When Mahmud ibn Zarkan Pasha arrived in 1593 to replace Judar Pasha, one of his first acts was to round up the senior scholars of Timbuktu and prepare them for deportation to Marrakesh. The grounds were political. The new commander regarded the scholarly establishment as a potential nucleus of resistance, a class of men whose authority and networks made them dangerous as long as they remained in the city. He may have been right about this, in the sense that people who have built something tend to have views about those who are dismantling it. Whether their views constituted an actionable threat is a different question. Ahmad Baba was among those arrested. The accounts of his arrest suggest he did not go quietly. He objected. He made clear, in terms that were apparently unambiguous enough to be recorded by those present, that he considered the action unjust and the authority behind it illegitimate. This was not a safe position to take with an armed administration in a freshly conquered city, and it reflects something about the character of the man, a scholar whose entire training had been in the precise articulation of what was and was not legally correct, who had written treatises on justice and governance, who was now being arrested by men whose presence in the city he regarded as a straightforward violation of Islamic law. They took him anyway. The march to Marrakesh was long. The scholars traveled north through the Sahara, back along the route the army had come. Some of the journey was on foot. The conditions were, by the accounts that survived, harsh in a specific way that bureaucratically organized suffering tends to be harsh. Not necessarily brutal in any single dramatic moment, but grinding, disrespectful, the ordinary indignity of being moved from place to place at someone else's schedule with no control over when you eat or sleep or stop. Ahmad Baba arrived in Marrakesh in 1594. He was 60 years old, or close to it, far from home, his library confiscated, his colleagues scattered. He was also, as his captors and their contemporaries would discover, completely unwilling to perform the role of a defeated man. What awaited him in Marrakesh, and what he left there, is the next chapter's story. But it begins with what he said not long after arriving. When asked about what had been taken from him, he described his library. He gave the number, more than 1,600 volumes, the working collection of a man who considered himself among the lesser scholars of the city. He was not complaining of personal loss in the way a man who had lost money complains. He was making a precise intellectual and legal argument about what Timbuktu actually was and what the act of confiscating its books actually meant. The men listening to him in Marrakesh had no framework for understanding the city he was describing. They had been told they were occupying a rich and backward province of Sudan. What they were hearing from a prisoner who had just walked across the Sahara was a different account entirely. Ahmad Baba arrived in Marrakesh with nothing he had not carried in his memory, and he made it clear from the beginning that he intended to use all of it. The city he entered was not, by any outward measure, an enemy of scholarship. The Saadian court of Ahmad al-Mansur was cultured, multilingual, engaged with the wider Islamic intellectual world. The palace complex al-Mansur was building, the El-Badi Palace, financed in no small part by the gold and sugar revenues of a prosperous state, was extravagant in the way that confident dynasties are extravagant. A declaration in marble and cedar and painted tile of how the Sultan wished to be seen. Al-Mansur collected scholars and craftsmen and poets with genuine appetite. He was not a man who despised learning. He did not, apparently, despise Ahmad Baba either. By the accounts that survive, including Ahmad Baba's own writings, which are precise in what they say and careful about what they omit, Al-Mansur received him an audience at some point after his arrival, and the two men spoke. The conversation, as later described, did not go in a direction the Sultan might have expected. Al-Mansur asked, in what seemed to have been conciliatory terms, why Ahmad Baba had never come to Marrakesh before. The implication was that a scholar of his reputation would always have been welcome. Ahmad Baba's response, again as recorded in later accounts, was to point out that he had never come to Marrakesh because he had not been at war with Morocco. He had been living in his city, working in his field, harming nobody. He was in Marrakesh now because he had been brought there by force against Islamic law without justification. If the Sultan wished to discuss his presence in Morocco, that seemed like the relevant starting point. There is no clean record of what Al-Mansur said in response to this. What is clear is what followed. Ahmad Baba was not imprisoned further. He was not punished for his frankness in a way that is historically visible. He was held in Marrakesh, his movements constrained, unable to return home. But within those constraints, he was permitted, perhaps even encouraged, given the appetite of the Saadian court for prestigious intellectual figures, to do what he had always done. He taught, he wrote, he corresponded. In Marrakesh, Ahmad Baba attracted students with a speed and consistency that tells us something about how his reputation had traveled ahead of him. The scholars of Morocco and the wider North African world knew who he was. His treatises on Maliki jurisprudence were already in circulation. His opinions on contested legal questions carried weight that crossed whatever political dividing lines separated Timbuktu from Marrakesh. So even in captivity, in a city he had not chosen to be in, he became a figure around whom intellectual life organized itself, holding sessions at the Shurafa Mosque, answering questions, maintaining a correspondence with scholars from Cairo. Tafez that shows, in its breadth and its tone, a man who had refused to treat his own situation as permanent. His output during the Marrakesh years was remarkable under any circumstances, and close to astonishing given the circumstances that actually applied. He completed the Nail al-Ibtihaj, a biographical dictionary of Maliki scholars across Islamic history that remains a primary source for historians of Islamic North and West Africa to this day. He produced a legal treatise specifically examining the question of whether West Africans could be legitimately enslaved. The question had become pressing as the trans-Saharan slave trade expanded, and various traders had advanced the argument that sub-Saharan Africans were legitimate targets for enslavement by virtue of geography or ethnic origin. Ahmad Baba's treatise examined the question with the same precision he brought to any legal problem and reached a conclusion that undercut the argument at its foundation. The criterion for legitimate enslavement under Maliki law was religious status, not race or origin, and many of the West African peoples being enslaved had been Muslim for generations, which made their enslavement illegal regardless of who was profiting from it. This was a scholarly argument, not an abolitionist one in any modern sense, but within its own framework, it was a serious and principled challenge to the commercial logic that was consuming thousands of lives. Ahmad al-Mansur died in 1603, killed by plague along with much of his court in an epidemic that swept Morocco with the kind of indiscriminate force that makes the most powerful men on earth temporarily equivalent to everyone else. The Saadian dynasty did not survive him cleanly. The succession produced a factional struggle that had ended so many dynasties before it, Morocco fragmenting into competing centers of power in the years that followed. The coherent state that had produced a Saharan expedition dissolving into its component ambitions. The Sudan, from Marrakesh's perspective, became an afterthought. Ahmad Baba returned to Timbuktu in 1607, or possibly 1608. The sources give slightly different dates. He had been in Morocco for 13 or 14 years. He was in his early 60s or mid-60s. The city he came back to was not the city he had left. The population had declined substantially. The great commercial networks that had made Timbuktu the hinge of the trans-Saharan trade had not recovered from the disruption of the conquest and the uncertainty of the occupation. Merchants rerouted, caravans diverted. The trust-based relationships that long-distance commerce depends on broken and not rebuilt. The scholarly community had contracted. Some families had returned from exile. Others had not, had made permanent homes in Walata and Jen and further afield, integrating into other communities and carrying their books with them. The Sankor quarter was quieter than it had been. What governed the city, in a formal sense, was now a pasha appointed from Marrakesh. But as Moroccan attention withdrew following al-Mansur's death and the subsequent fragmentation of the Saadian state, the connection between Marrakesh and the Sudan grew thinner, and then nominal and then effectively non-existent. By the 1640s or so, the men ruling the Niger Bend on Moroccan authority were ruling it on the basis of credentials that no one in Morocco was any longer capable of validating or revoking. They were on their own. These men and their descendants became known as the Arma, from the Arabic term for marksman, a reference to the harquebuses that had made the conquest possible, now repurposed as a label for the lineage that the conquest had left behind. The Arma were, in a few generations, something genuinely new, a community of mixed Moroccan, Andalusian, and West African ancestry, rooted in the Niger Bend by the simple fact that they had been there long enough that nowhere else was home. Their formal relationship with Morocco had dissolved. Their cultural identity had hybridized. They maintained the posture of a ruling class for a time, but the scale of what they governed shrank decade by decade as the broader economic and political system that had made the Niger Bend worth governing cease to function at the level it once had. The great commercial era of Timbuktu, the era of the manuscripts and the book trade, and the scholar students from Egypt and Fez, and everywhere else in the Islamic world, did not end in a single moment. It deflated slowly, like an architecture that loses its internal pressure. The buildings remained. The mosques remained. People remained. But the thing that had made the place extraordinary, the combination of wealth and safety and scholarly patronage and connected markets that only works when all its components are functioning simultaneously. That thing was gone. What replaced it was smaller, more local, more precarious. Ahmad Baba went back to his work. He died in Timbuktu in 1627, old by the standards of his era, still writing. He had outlived the empire he was born into, the sultan who had imprisoned him, and the Moroccan occupation's brief moment of coherence. He had not outlived the scholarship. The manuscripts, in the meantime, had gone to ground, not in any organized way, not by any single decision, but across hundreds of families and thousands of individual choices. The books were hidden, put in wooden chests and buried beneath house floors, sealed into walls, wrapped in leather and stored in desert caches known only to the families responsible for them. The logic was not complicated. Books were valuable. Books were vulnerable. Books were something that soldiers and occupiers in subsequent waves of instability tended to treat as either trophies or fuel. The scholars who had built these collections had spent their lives understanding what the text contained. Their descendants understood, even if they could not always read what they were preserving, that these objects mattered. Some collections were lost. Fire, flood, insects, neglect across generations that could not read the scripts or understand the languages. All of these claimed their share over 3 centuries between the conquest and the modern world's first systematic attention to what was there. But the proportion that survived is, given the conditions of survival, extraordinary. When Western scholars and then Malian authorities began to seriously catalog the manuscript collections of Timbuktu in the late 20th century, they found something that the conventional history of Africa, written largely by people who had decided in advance that there was nothing to find, had not prepared them for. Not dozens of manuscripts, not hundreds of thousands. Private family collections of 3,000, 5,000, and 10,000 volumes, maintained across generations in conditions of secrecy and care by families who had not forgotten what they were holding. Institutional collections at the mosques, depleted but not destroyed. Caches that had never been disturbed. The Ahmed Baba Institute, named with a deliberateness that carries its own argument, for the man whose library was confiscated in 1593, was established to receive, catalog, conserve, and eventually make available for scholarship this accumulated archive. By the early years of the 21st century, it held tens of thousands of documents. The Mama Haidar Library, one of the larger private collections, held comparable numbers. Across all the collections in and around Timbuktu, the estimates of the total manuscript archive range from 300,000 to considerably higher, with the upper figures including texts that are known to exist but have not yet been fully examined. Then, in 2012, it nearly happened again. A coalition of Tuareg separatists and Islamist militants seized northern Mali in the spring of that year, overrunning Timbuktu in a matter of days. The Islamist factions in particular had made clear their attitude towards shrines, monuments, and objects of cultural veneration that competed, in their ideology, with their version of religious purity. They destroyed the medieval mausoleums of Timbuktu's saints, demolishing structures that had stood for 5 centuries, that were themselves irreplaceable documents of the city's history in stone and earthen form. The manuscripts were next, or seemed to be. What happened instead was one of the more remarkable logistical operations in the recent history of cultural preservation. Abdul Qadir Haidara, whose family ran one of the great private manuscript libraries, organized a clandestine evacuation that involved hundreds of people, networks of vehicles and river boats, safe houses in multiple towns, and the cooperation of communities across the country. Over the course of months, in conditions of active conflict, somewhere in a region of 350,000 manuscripts were moved from Timbuktu to Bamako, the Malian capital. They were transported in trunks, in bags, in boxes, by boat down the Niger and overland by road, through checkpoints and around areas of fighting. When French military intervention in January 2013 pushed the Islamist forces out of Timbuktu, the bulk of what mattered had already been moved. Some was lost. Reports in the immediate aftermath suggested that Islamist fighters set fire to a portion of the Ahmed Baba Institute's building before leaving, and that some texts were destroyed. The number given varies. The loss was real. But the scale of what survived, because of decisions made 6 centuries ago to hide things in walls and underfloors, because of families who kept faith with collections they could not always read, because of one librarian who organized an evacuation under fire. That scale is its own kind of answer to anyone who has ever needed an answer. The manuscripts are being read now, translated, digitized, cataloged. Scholars of Islamic law and astronomy and medicine and history are finding in them a body of knowledge that rewrites, in careful and specific ways, our understanding of what the pre-modern world actually looked like across its full geographic range. What they are finding is not a surprise to historians who are already paying attention, but it is a corrective, document by document, to a long habit of not looking. The habit, like the smoke at Tondibi, is beginning to clear. Return to the plain north of Gao. The 12th of March, 1591. The dust settling after the cattle turned back. That image has carried the whole story, but it means something different now than it did at the beginning. The cattle turned from something they could not understand, and in their turning created the chaos that finished the empire. This is also, in a compressed form, what happened to a wider world's understanding of what Timbuktu was. It turned away from something it had not been equipped to comprehend, and the turn became, over centuries, a habit of absence that looked like evidence of absence. There was nothing there, because we did not look. We did not look, because we assumed there was nothing there. The circle held, until the manuscripts broke it. What Tondibi meant in its own moment was this. The same technological revolution that carried European ships into every ocean in the 15th and 16th centuries, the same gunpowder logic that allowed small professional armies to project force across vast distances, arrived in the Western Sudan, and did what it was doing everywhere else on the planet simultaneously. It did not single out Songhai. It ran through West Africa the way it ran through the Aztec Empire and the Indian Ocean trade systems and the Ottoman-Persian frontier. The redistribution of military advantage toward firearms was global, rapid, and essentially without exceptions. Timbuktu was not uniquely vulnerable. It was simply in the way of a force that was in everyone's way. What makes it distinctive? What lifts the story out of the category of another fallen empire and into something that continues to matter is the manuscripts, not as symbols, as documents, as the ongoing, recoverable, still being read testimony of a civilization that built something of intellectual substance in a place, and a period that the dominant historical tradition had filed under irrelevance. Ahmad Baba standing before Al-Mansur and telling him the arrest was illegal was not merely a brave man making a personal protest. He was making a claim about what Timbuktu was: a city of law, of scholarship, of a tradition sophisticated enough to produce binding arguments about what constituted justice. The claim was not believed by the Sultan. It is available now in the archives. The Ahmed Baba Institute carries his name, not as decoration, but as an argument. The argument is that he was right about what the city was. The evidence is on the shelves. There is a particular kind of loss that this story points toward, not the loss of buildings or political structures or even of lives, though all of those were real and considerable, but the loss of what a civilization knew, the astronomical calculations in those manuscripts, the medical knowledge, the legal reasoning, the historical memory. Some of it has been recovered. Some of it was lost in fires or floods or the long indifference of centuries. We cannot know the full shape of what is missing because the missing is, by definition, not there to be measured. What we can know is that it was there, that a city at the desert's edge had accumulated over 2 centuries of scholarship and commerce and patronage, that was real, that the smoke above Tondibi did not erase it as completely as the men with harquebuses intended. The cattle turned back. The manuscripts did not. That is the answer to the question this story began with: how a civilization built on a century of military dominance and one of the great concentrations of human knowledge anywhere on earth could be finished in a morning. The answer is easily and permanently, and also not quite completely. The empire ended. The knowledge survived. 400 years later, it is still being read.